Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. If there was ever a thing more piercing than hunger, Maria had tasted it too early. Loneliness. It wasn't the type that visits in moments, the kind that lingers after friends leave or a party ends. Hers was the kind that made a home inside her ribs, settled under her chest like a second heartbeat, and never left. Her parents, George and Brenda, weren't cruel people. In fact, the neighbors called them respectable. George was a retired head librarian, with fingers always dusted in paper ash, while Brenda taught typing and shorthand at Brookhall Vocational. But what made the walls of their house so hollow was not the absence of noise, but the absence of warmth. George spent most evenings behind the door of his reading room, his voice barely used unless the tap leaked or dinner came late. Brenda moved like a ghost who had somewhere more than to be. She spoke in instructions and nodded in place of hugs. Their home was clean, structured, polite, but cold, a place where spoons never clanged and laughter didn't echo. Maria, their only child, grew up in this echo chamber, learning early that silence could be so loud it rang in the ears. She arranged her teddy bears into dinner guests every night, complete with spoons and cups. She spoke to them with the tenderness of a sister, the discipline of a mother, and the neediness of a child begging not to be left alone. When lights went off, she would sometimes whisper into the darkness, "Good night, imaginary family," and pull the blanket tighter, hoping the warmth of pretend love would seep into her bones. The house was filled with the clinks of careful footsteps, the hum of a refrigerator, the tick of the living room clock, but never footsteps running down the hallway, never the call of a sibling playing hide and seek, never the sound of another toothbrush being dipped into the cup beside hers. Maria carried her childhood like a shadow stretched longer than her frame, invisible to the world, but heavy enough to shape how she moved. At school, she wasn't bullied or disliked. She was simply forgotten. She made average grades, never stood in line for choir tryouts, and sat in the middle rows during assemblies where no teacher would notice if she cried. Her birthday parties were always full of cake and empty chairs. Her parents would set up a table in the backyard, tie balloons to the gate, even hire a small clown if they remembered in time. But children from school often had other plans, and the few that came left before the second round of games. Brenda would collect the untouched drinks, wipe down the plastic chairs, and say, "At least you had something nice," not knowing how her words landed like stones in Maria's small stomach. As she got older, Maria learned the art of self-soothing. She'd bake cupcakes and eat them one by one, pretending each was handed to her by a friend. She stitched names into her pillowcase: Clara, Elsie, Joyce, names she imagined would have been her sisters. She never told anyone about this, not because she was ashamed, but because she feared no one would understand. Loneliness was not always dramatic. Sometimes it just felt like eating without anyone asking for a bite, or laughing alone and feeling silly about it, or getting sick and having only one set of eyes checking your temperature without a hint of panic or affection. Even her diary felt bored of hearing the same wish repeated: "I just want someone. Anyone. Someone to miss me when I'm gone, someone to knock on my door just because they can." One afternoon when she was 10, Maria met a girl who changed the way the wind felt. Her name was Wendy, short for Winifred, but no one called her that, not even her mother. Wendy had 4 siblings, 2 of whom were twins, and their house looked like it had been built by chaos and love at the same time. Toys were everywhere, socks never matched, and someone was always either crying or laughing. When Wendy first invited Maria over, it was like stepping into color after living in black and white. The kitchen smelled of overcooked stew and burnt toast, the couches were mismatched, and yet Maria felt her heart expand like it had more room to breathe. Wendy talked too much, asked too many questions, and sometimes forgot Maria was even in the room, but Maria didn't mind. It was noise, warm, living noise, and Maria fed on it like honey. But the sweetness didn't last. Wendy was often pulled away to babysit or clean or help her brothers, and she'd say, "Just stay, I'll be back," only to return after hours or not at all. Still, Maria clung to every second she got. She learned to sit on the porch and wait with her chin resting on her knees, counting cracks on the pavement, imagining herself as Wendy's honorary sister. But the wind doesn't stay still. At the end of the school year, Wendy's father got transferred, and they moved out of Brook Hall. No goodbye letter, no final playdate, just an empty gate and a locked door. Maria passed by the house every day for weeks, hoping for something, anything, but silence had returned like a landlord claiming back rent. She didn't cry. She just stood there, arms folded, whispering Wendy's name like a lullaby to herself, the same way a sailor repeats an island's name after a shipwreck, hoping it still exists somewhere in the world. By the time Maria turned 24, the lonely girl in her had learned how to dress properly and speak with control, but she was still very much alive. When Maria met Joshua, he was sanding the frame of a church bench behind St. Agatha's Chapel. He had kind eyes and a voice that felt like the beginning of a familiar song. He wasn't flashy. He didn't quote poems or arrive on motorbikes. He just saw her, noticed her, asked what she was reading, asked it again the next week. Their courtship was slow, almost old-fashioned. Letters, walks, a bench beneath the almond tree where silence wasn't heavy, only companionable. And yet even on their wedding night, Maria lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan, afraid that marriage wouldn't be enough. Afraid that the silence would find a back door into their home. Afraid that Joshua's warm hands wouldn't be enough to replace a lifetime of cold spaces. She loved him, genuinely, but love didn't erase what she'd grown up missing. It only gave her hope. She didn't tell him everything, not at first. How do you tell a man, "I'm afraid of quiet"? Instead, she whispered to herself, the way she had always done, "I want our home to be full. I want it bursting with sound, with footsteps, with toothbrushes, with names written on walls in crayon. I don't want silence to follow me anymore." And from that moment, without knowing it, she began to water a plan rooted deep in her soul, a plan to make sure none of her children would ever eat cake with empty chairs. Maria's first year of marriage unfolded like a tightly folded wrapper that gradually loosened under sunlight. She and Joshua had rented a modest two-bedroom flat on the eastern edge of Brook Hall, a building painted in fading cream, with chipped windowsills and a gate that cried whenever it moved. It wasn't much, but it had space, and to Maria, space was a kind of wealth. She painted the second room yellow, not because she was pregnant yet, but because yellow felt like what hope would wear if it became a color. The days were quiet in a manageable way, filled with the ordinary business of newlyweds learning the creases in each other's habits. Maria preferred boiling water twice before drinking. Joshua sometimes left his wet towel on the bed. They were small things, the kind you smile through with a half-frown. But in the quiet moments when Joshua wasn't around, when he had gone to fix cabinets or run errands, Maria's mind slipped into long corridors lined with old echoes. The silence would climb through the windows, uninvited, and sit beside her like a shadow. She'd busy herself arranging baby things that hadn't been bought yet, drawing up imaginary meal plans and cutting out magazine pictures of family spaces, 3 kids, 1 couch, dog optional. Sometimes she'd sit in the painted yellow room and hum lullabies to no one in particular, pretending she could already hear the gurgle of a baby on the floor. Joshua walked in once and found her singing to a soft pillow shaped like a bear. He said nothing, just smiled and went to wash his hands. But the look lingered, not judgment, but a pause, a silent wondering. Maria never told him she had already picked names, Clara if it's a girl, Ben if it's a boy. Not for tradition's sake, but because she needed to call someone something. The names stayed folded in the back of her heart like prayer requests never dropped into the offering basket. It wasn't long before the news came, and it arrived quietly, without fanfare. Maria's period was late by a few days, then by a week, and one afternoon, after buying groundnut oil from the corner shop, she stopped by the pharmacy and bought a test strip, her hands trembling like leaves in the rainy season. She didn't tell Joshua immediately. Instead, she waited till he got back and made dinner like any other night, okra soup with semo, because it was his favorite. They ate while watching a rerun of a crime drama neither of them understood. When they were done and the dishes were rinsed, she pulled the tiny strip from her bag and laid it on the table. She said nothing. Joshua looked at it, then looked at her, and the look in his eyes said everything. There was no grand excitement, no jumping. Just a slow smile that crept up his face like the sun rising after a night of heavy rain. He touched her hand and whispered, "You sure?" And she nodded, eyes wet and shining. In the weeks that followed, Maria bloomed like a plant finally kissed by rain. She was nauseous half the time, tired the other half, but her heart pulsed with a kind of joy that made every ache feel sacred. She began talking to her belly at night, rubbing it as though it could understand. "You're not going to be alone," she'd whisper. "You'll never know what it means to sleep in a silent house." Joshua built a small wooden crib in the evenings, sanding each corner smooth, while Maria sat on the floor beside him with her legs stretched, describing how the baby would smile. When they went to the hospital and found out it was a girl, Maria cried, not because she preferred girls, but because it confirmed something she had always felt in her bones. Her daughter was already real, already walking toward her in her dreams. Clara arrived just before the first rains of the new year, a tiny bundle of reddish-brown skin and sleepy eyes, and when Maria held her, the world shifted, just slightly, but enough to make her feel that her childhood had not been in vain. She had waited long for this noise. The cries in the night were lullabies to her. The diapers, her new ministry. What Joshua didn't expect was how quickly Maria would want another child. He assumed they'd wait a year or two, let Clara grow some teeth, say her first words. But 2 months after Clara turned 6 months, Maria began suggesting they should try again. At first, Joshua thought she was joking. "Let's breathe first," he said one morning while fastening his belt. Clara still eating her fingers. Maria laughed it off, but her heart had already made a decision. She didn't say it aloud, but she'd begun to feel that time was not a river. They could not dip the same foot twice. What if something happened? What if one day God changed his mind? What if they waited and waiting became loss? The fear wasn't logical, but it sat inside her, rocking slowly like an old woman on a veranda. So she stopped taking her pills, quietly. She prayed in silence, just like she used to pray as a child, for a room full of voices, for a fridge with fingerprints, for shoes lined up by the door in pairs. By the time Clara celebrated her first birthday, Maria was already 3 months pregnant. Joshua was surprised, but softened quickly. Ben was born 9 months later, quiet, observant, with fingers that clutched the world like it owed him answers. The neighbors said it was too soon. Brenda, her mother, called and asked if she was okay upstairs, but Maria only smiled. She looked at Clara crawling toward Ben's cot and whispered, "That's your brother. Talk to him. Laugh with him. Don't let him be alone, not even in his dreams." She began to hum again, soft lullabies she never remembered learning, melodies that rose like mist from old memory. Before the year folded its arms, Maria's womb opened again like a door that refused to lock. Elsie came unannounced, like a guest who didn't knock but was welcome anyway. The pregnancy was harder this time, her back ached more, and her feet swelled till her slippers cried for help, but Maria wore the discomfort like a badge. 3 children in 3 years. Even the nurses at the clinic started calling her Madam Born every year. Some said it with teasing, others with concern. Joshua's brows began to furrow deeper, and one night while rocking Ben to sleep, he asked her quietly, "Why are you racing?" Maria didn't answer at first. She just kissed the crown of Ben's head and said, "I'm not racing. I'm gathering." It wasn't until Elsie arrived, eyes wide like someone reborn from the stars, that Maria felt the ache in her chest soften into something new, fulfillment. Not perfection, not peace, but a kind of rightness she had never known. Their house was noisy now. Clara shouted at cartoons. Ben clanged pots. Elsie cried as though she was born rehearsing choir parts. Maria sat on the edge of her bed one afternoon, surrounded by laundry, bottles, toys, and giggles, and wept, not from sorrow, not from stress, but from a sacred, hidden kind of healing. The girl who once threw birthday parties for her dolls had created her own guests, real ones. No more whispering goodnight into the dark. There were now hands pulling at her blouse, voices calling Mummy from every corner. The silence had finally been evicted, and in its place, life, messy and miraculous. By the time Elsie turned 5 months old, the walls of their house had learned how to breathe alongside Maria's routine. There was no longer a moment untouched by the pitter-patter of little feet, the shrill cry of an unsettled nap, or the musical clatter of toy blocks rolling across tiled floors like tiny rebellions. Their home was no longer a house. It had become a soundscape, a playground, a battlefield, and a cradle all at once. Maria was both general and servant in this carefully balanced kingdom. She moved like water from room to room, wrapping bodies in towels, peeling banana skins with one hand, stirring porridge with the other, and shushing cries with soft hums that carried the weight of old lullabies. Her days blurred like watercolors left out in the rain, beautiful but without borders. Yet inside her, a quiet thunder brewed. It wasn't anger or regret, but something she couldn't yet name. There were moments when she'd sit still, clutching Elsie to her chest, while Clara shouted about a missing crayon and Ben screamed from the bathroom because the flush scared him, and she'd feel a hollowness that startled her. Not emptiness, but a deep echo, as if she were calling out from inside a cave of her own making, wondering whether anyone could hear her. The kind of ache that doesn't ask for relief, only recognition. Joshua noticed it in the way she stared longer at the window some evenings, her eyes trying to find something beyond the curtain fluttering in the harmattan wind. He'd ask if she was fine, and she'd reply, "I'm just tired," because how do you explain to someone that you're not lost, but still feel like you're wandering? The whispers started outside their walls before Maria ever heard them directly. It began with the dry cleaner at the junction who once said to Joshua, "Now, for your wife, oh, she no day rest at all," and followed with a chuckle that didn't hide its meaning. Then came the market women, one of whom pressed her hands into Maria's shoulders and said, "This your factory too active. Ye go spoil if you no slow down." Maria smiled politely, swallowed her words like bitter cola, and walked away. But the wind carried gossip better than any radio. Soon it became common for strangers to comment on the size of her family as though she'd given birth on their behalf. "She won't build football team," one man said near the clinic, and Maria heard it clearly even though he was pretending to talk on the phone. What hurt wasn't just the mockery. It was the suggestion that her choices were rooted in carelessness rather than pain. People mistook volume for recklessness. They thought she was desperate, irresponsible, unhinged. They didn't see the diary entries of a girl who begged for noise in her childhood. They hadn't shared birthday cake with silent toys. They didn't know that each child of hers was an anchor tying her to the world, helping her float where once she nearly drowned in invisibility. Even some of Joshua's friends began pulling him aside to suggest balance, and he, caught between love and pressure, began raising eyebrows when she talked about school enrollment or shopping for a bunk bed. "Maybe we should just pause," he said one night. "Just breathe. Give space. We're doing well, but let's not overwhelm ourselves." Maria nodded, lips trembling. But deep down, she wasn't trying to overwhelm life. She was simply making up for all the space that once overwhelmed her. One Sunday evening, after church service, a young woman named Nancy, elegant, sharp-tongued, newly married, cornered Maria by the children's section, holding her handbag like it contained judgments. "I admire your strength," she began, voice too sweet to be sincere, "but don't you think you're a bit too fast? I mean, 3 kids, back to back? Isn't that kind of reckless?" Her tone was a dagger wrapped in lace. Maria didn't respond immediately. She adjusted Elsie on her hip, reached to zip Clara's half-open purse, and helped Ben sit on the edge of the pavement beside her before lifting her eyes. "Thank you for your concern," she replied, the softness in her voice masking the fire beneath. Nancy blinked, surprised at the calm. "I just think women should plan better," she continued. Maria's smile thinned. "Some of us are planting where we were once famished," she said. "Planning looks different when you've known hunger of a different kind." She turned to walk away, each step deliberate, her children trailing her like petals behind a quiet bloom. That night, after putting all 3 to sleep, Maria sat on the veranda while Joshua cleaned the blender inside. The stars above Brook Hall twinkled like mischievous eyes, and the crickets chirped in rhythm. She pulled her knees to her chest and sighed, a long, unedited release. Joshua stepped out and joined her, handing her a cup of warm water with lemon. "They don't know, do they?" he asked. "They don't need to," she whispered, but her heart told her otherwise. Maybe one day she would explain. But tonight she just needed silence, her kind, not the childhood kind, the kind that held peace, not punishment. It was on a Tuesday morning, just as Maria was cleaning Elsie's feeding bottle, that Clara asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mummy," she said, dragging a sock across the floor like a tail, "why do I have so many people in my house and my friend doesn't?" Maria chuckled at first, her hands still swirling inside the soapy bowl. But then she paused, turned, and knelt to Clara's level. "Because I wanted you to never feel alone," she said quietly. "Did you feel alone?" Clara asked, her voice innocent, unarmed. Maria looked at her, touched her cheek, and nodded. "Yes, very much." The conversation ended there, but it echoed long after. That afternoon, Maria wrote in her journal, a habit she had picked up again, though this time the pages were less about pain and more about preservation. She wrote about things the children said, the way Elsie held her pinky finger tightly, the way Ben talked to ants, the way Clara danced when no one watched. She wrote about how love could be noisy, chaotic, and utterly healing. And for the first time since Elsie's birth, she admitted she was tired, not of them, but of defending herself to the world. She wasn't asking to be celebrated. She only wanted to be seen clearly. Joshua came home later that evening with puff puffs wrapped in old newspaper and held her longer than usual. "I got your kind," he said, and Maria laughed through her nose, resting her head on his shoulder. The children ran around them, wild and uninhibited, and for that brief hour before bedtime, Maria allowed herself the luxury of being still, not because there was nothing to do, but because she had finally learned that rest was also a form of resistance. The months that followed felt like living inside a whirlwind disguised as a lullaby. Maria moved through her days with grace sharpened by necessity, every minute woven with the business of survival, of schedules, snacks, school runs, fevers, and the delicate art of keeping 3 young children from imploding in the same room. The house was louder now, its walls echoing with everything from alphabet songs to tantrums about mismatched shoes. Yet beneath the riot of movement there lingered an invisible string tugging at her, a fatigue not cured by sleep, a tension not eased by prayer or paracetamol. Joshua, ever present and helpful, had begun rising earlier, taking on more chores without being asked. He wasn't blind to the toll the years had pressed upon her, though he sometimes struggled to interpret it. He'd often kiss her on the forehead and say, "You're doing more than most," and while his voice carried affection, Maria sometimes wished his words came with permission to pause. But she didn't say this out loud. To admit she needed rest felt too close to suggesting regret, and she would never let her children become casualties of what was once her salvation. Her love for them wasn't performative. It burned hot, sacred, eternal. But even sacred fires need tending, and hers had begun to flicker in corners she couldn't reach. Some evenings, she'd sit on the bathroom floor after bathing all three children, steam still clinging to the walls, her wrapper damp and her face glistening from effort. There, in that narrow space with the door locked, she'd listen to their muffled voices behind the hallway door. Ben arguing about toys, Clara making up songs, Elsie fussing over missing socks. It should have sounded like music, yet sometimes it came to her ears like a drum too tightly stretched. She loved them without condition, but there were days she wondered if she had buried herself too deep beneath the weight of mothering. Her dreams of taking photography classes, learning to swim, or finishing the novel she once started in her late teens now felt like dusty trinkets buried beneath laundry baskets. And still, Maria told no one. Not her mother, who would only say, "Well, you chose this path." Not her neighbor, Chenier, whose children were grown and whose advice always carried a tone too close to condescension. Not even Joshua, who, though patient and kind, still didn't fully understand the kind of ache that could live in a woman who had everything she prayed for. One night after she had finally coaxed all three children to sleep, Maria stepped out into the compound and stared up at the sky. A faint breeze carried the scent of fried plantain from a distant apartment. She exhaled. Not from relief, but from restraint. She hadn't cried in weeks, and now even her tears felt like they had grown tired of showing up. That night, she whispered into the air, "I love them more than breath, but I miss pieces of me I never had time to become." When the weight of unsaid things becomes too heavy, life often finds its own way of forcing the truth into the open. It happened on a Saturday. Joshua had taken Ben to get a haircut, and Maria was home with the girls. She had promised Clara they would bake banana bread together, but Elsie had woken from her nap screaming and refused to be calmed by milk, lullabies, or even back rubs. Clara stood by the kitchen counter, mixing bowl in hand, while Maria rocked a shrieking Elsie on her hip, sweat soaking through the back of her blouse. The tension in the air coiled tighter by the second. When Clara accidentally spilled half the flour on the tiled floor, Maria snapped, not with rage, but with a voice so sharp and sudden that it startled even her. "Can't you just wait a second?" she shouted, and immediately regretted it. Clara froze, eyes wide, mixing spoon still in her hand. Elsie's cries grew louder. Maria sank to the floor, clutching both children, whispering, I'm so sorry," over and over like a scratched record. When Joshua returned, he found her there, surrounded by spilled flour and undone hair, her eyes bloodshot and her voice trembling. That night, they sat on the living room floor after the children slept. Maria finally opened the floodgates. Every bottled fear, every quiet resentment, every moment she questioned herself. Joshua listened, his hands clasped, his eyes never leaving hers. "I never wanted to prove anything," she said. "I just wanted to rewrite what childhood felt like." He nodded slowly, then took her hand. "Then let's do it differently from here," he said. "Let's not just fill the house with children. Let's fill it with you two." Maria didn't change overnight. Healing, she discovered, was not a ceremony. It was a slow dance with moments of stumbling and grace. She started by taking morning walks alone, while Joshua stayed back with the kids. Just 10 minutes around the compound, but those walks became sacred, her heartbeat syncing with the sound of gravel underfoot, her breath realigning with her spirit. Then she dusted off her old notebook, the one filled with poems and story fragments, and began writing again. Not entire pages at first, just lines, observations, snippets of thought. But even that brought a flicker back to her eyes. Joshua enrolled Clara in a nearby preschool, and Maria found herself with brief windows of quiet when only Ben and Elsie were home. Windows she used not to clean or fold clothes, but to sit, breathe, and sometimes do nothing at all. It felt strange at first, almost illegal, this act of resting. But slowly, the guilt ebbed, replaced by a quiet knowing. She could be a devoted mother and still be herself. She began to say no to things that drained her and yes to things that sparked light. One afternoon, while combing Clara's hair, Clara asked, "Mummy, do you still want to bake banana bread with me?" And Maria, smiling, said, "Yes, let's do it together. But let's pour the flour slowly this time." They laughed, and the laugh wasn't forced. It rose from a place long neglected. That night, as she tucked in her children, kissed their foreheads, and dimmed the lights, Maria stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the shapes of their small bodies rise and fall with sleep. The house was full, the rooms alive, and somewhere in the rhythm of those sleeping breaths, Maria found the melody of herself again, not as the girl who once craved voices, but as the woman who finally made peace with her own. Maria had always believed that love, when quiet, could be mistaken for duty, and when loud, misunderstood as desperation. It was this thought that nestled in her chest the morning she overheard two women from church standing near the front pew, talking just low enough to be overheard. She had arrived early to drop off snacks for the children's class and walked past them on her way out of the hall, catching only fragments of a conversation that turned her bones cold. "That's the one woman whispered, her voice a mix of amusement and concern, the one with the 3 babies. I heard she said she was lonely as a child, so she just, started birthing her own siblings?" The other woman laughed lightly, not maliciously, but enough to sting. "Maybe she needs a therapist, not a nursery," she said, and they both chuckled as if sharing a harmless joke. Maria didn't stop walking, didn't flinch, didn't break stride. But something within her shifted, a tear along the seam of her quiet confidence. By the time she reached home, her hands shook as she opened the front door. Elsie ran to her, grinning with crumbs on her cheeks, and Ben called from the kitchen, "Mummy, look at my drawing." But Maria couldn't speak. Not yet. She bent down, kissed each of them, then went into the bedroom and lay on the bed, her arm over her eyes, trying to convince her breath to stay steady. That day, Joshua returned to find her curled up in a quiet room full of noise. When he asked what happened, she only said, "They think I'm crazy, Josh. They think I'm broken." It took days for Maria to stop hearing those voices in her head like a chorus, rehearsing the same verse. Even when she went to the market or the salon, she felt watched. Her smile became a mask she adjusted carefully, only to remove behind closed doors. But on a quiet Thursday evening, everything began to change, not because someone apologized or public opinion shifted, but because her daughter asked a question that cracked something wide open. They were having dinner, beans and fried plantain, a meal Maria had cooked slowly, adding a pinch of love and a dash of distraction. Clara, now 4 and becoming more observant than Maria had expected, leaned forward and asked, "Mummy, why do people say it's bad to have a big family?" Maria paused, fork in hand. The table fell into an unexpected silence as the children looked up at her, waiting for the answer. Even Joshua leaned back slightly, curious how she would respond. Maria swallowed hard and said, "People don't always understand why others do what they do, but that doesn't make what we do wrong." Clara blinked, thoughtful. "Did you have brothers and sisters when you were small?" she asked. "No," Maria replied. "It was just me." Clara nodded slowly, then whispered, "That must have been boring." Maria let out a soft, genuine laugh. Not forced, not heavy, just true. "It was more than boring," she said. "It was quiet in a way that felt like being invisible." She didn't realize she was crying until Elsie reached out and touched her hand, tiny fingers, warm and unknowing. And in that moment, Maria made a decision not to defend herself anymore, but to tell her story before others tried to write it for her. The opportunity came faster than she expected. Brook Hall's Women's Fellowship had planned an event titled Mothers Beyond Measure, inviting local women to share experiences about balancing motherhood, identity, and wellness. Maria hadn't planned to attend. Events like that often felt like competitions in disguise, but Joshua encouraged her. "Maybe it's time you let people see the reason behind the rhythm," he said. She wore a modest green dress, the same one she wore to Clara's naming ceremony, and sat quietly in the back, listening as one woman after another stood to speak about career stress, marital silence, postpartum fatigue. When it was Maria's turn, she almost didn't rise. Her knees felt like wet cloth, and her palms grew moist. But when she stood and looked out at the room filled with women, some young, some old, some visibly tired, something rose within her like a tide no longer content to kiss the shore. "I was an only child," she began, voice steady but soft. "And I don't mean that in the way people mean when they say it proudly. I mean it in the way that feels like living in an echo chamber." She paused, scanning the room. No one moved. "I used to whisper names to myself because I had no one to call me sister. I rearranged my dolls just so the chairs at my birthday table wouldn't look empty." She went on, slowly, vulnerably, telling the truth without apology. How her children were not numbers or trophies, but living answers to old, buried prayers. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't the kind she grew up with. It was full. It was warm. One woman clapped slowly, then another. Some stood. A few wiped tears, and Maria sat down, not relieved, but released. That night, as she and Joshua folded laundry together in their room, Maria felt different. Not healed completely, not armored against future hurt, but seen, the way the sun sees a flower blooming after storm. Joshua picked up one of Clara's blouses and said, "They heard you." Maria nodded. "That's all I wanted," she said. And it was true. She didn't want pity or applause, just understanding. She now walked through town differently, shoulders looser, chin lifted not with pride, but with the dignity of someone who no longer carried shame like a second skin. When she returned to the church the following Sunday, the same women who once chuckled now greeted her with soft smiles, nods, and lingering looks of quiet respect. One even said, "Thank you," and though she didn't elaborate, Maria understood. The children continued growing like sunflowers, tall, vibrant, always reaching. Clara now drew family trees in school and needed extra sheets to fit everyone in. Ben liked counting chairs at dinner and naming them after superheroes. Elsie had begun stringing full sentences together, always ending them with, "Mummy, look!" Maria's days remained noisy, her arms constantly full. But now, when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a woman racing toward something undefined. She saw a mother who had finally made peace with the road she chose, one child at a time. And behind her smile was no longer a girl rearranging dolls in silence, but a woman who turned loneliness into legacy. Years passed with the quiet grace of an old song humming beneath everyday life. Maria no longer tracked days by bottles or bath times. Instead, she now moved through school runs, PTA meetings, and grocery lists with the practiced rhythm of someone who had walked every path barefoot and still chose not to complain. Clara turned 6 that year and wanted a unicorn-themed birthday party, which Joshua found amusing, since their compound barely had enough space for 3 plastic chairs and a folding table. Ben had grown into the curious child who asked questions about the sky, why beans looked different before and after boiling, and whether his name had wings like birds. Elsie, now almost 4, still cried when Maria wasn't in the room, though she had developed a habit of talking in her sleep, tiny murmurs about crayons and invisible friends. Their home, modest as it was, had become a revolving door of moments, some sacred, others ridiculous. Maria would sometimes find herself in the middle of brushing Elsie's hair while helping Clara tie her shoelaces and answering Ben's questions about ants, all at once. Yet through the chaos, she had learned to breathe differently. Not to control everything, but to let the noise become music. The same noise she once begged for in silence now wrapped around her like a shawl, loud, messy, comforting. Sometimes when the children were in bed and the house had gone from chatter to snores, Maria would stand in the kitchen and simply listen, not to the fridge hum or the distant generator, but to the absence of loneliness. It was in those moments she realized she had succeeded. She had built what she once only dared to imagine. But the world had not stopped asking questions. One Saturday afternoon, after returning from the market with yams and a fresh batch of tomatoes, Maria found herself cornered by a neighbor named Regina, a woman who was always well-dressed, always smelling of imported powder, and always too curious for her own good. They stood outside the compound beneath the mango tree that dropped fruit like confessions as Regina wiped her brow with a lace handkerchief and tilted her head. "Maria," she began, her voice soaked in feigned sweetness, "you've really tried, oh. But tell me truthfully, why didn't you wait? 3 children, back to back to back? What were you chasing?" Maria didn't flinch. She didn't fidget or fake a laugh. She simply shifted the bag on her hip and looked her neighbor squarely in the eye. "I wasn't chasing," she replied, voice firm like morning light. "I was planting." Regina blinked, unsure if she had misheard. "Planting what?" she asked, bewildered. "Company," Maria said. "Joy, laughter, protection, all the things I grew up without." Regina chuckled awkwardly, sensing the edge behind Maria's calm, then muttered, "Well, as long as you're coping." Maria nodded. "I'm not coping," she said softly. "I'm living." She walked away before the conversation could turn into another performance. That night, she told Joshua about it while folding laundry. He looked up and grinned. "You're finally giving it to them straight." Maria smiled. "I'm just tired of needing permission to tell the truth." And truly, she no longer needed anyone's approval to validate the life she had carved out with bare hands and borrowed hope. What surprised Maria most wasn't the noise or the workload, but how her children had begun reflecting pieces of her, tiny, polished mirrors holding fragments of who she once was and who she had become. Clara wrote a short poem in school titled "Home is Where My Mother Is" and received a standing ovation at the end-of-term presentation. Ben built a cardboard fort in the backyard and called it the Never Alone Castle. When Maria asked what that meant, he shrugged and said, "It's where everyone is allowed to feel like they belong." Elsie, whose voice had grown into a melody of questions and bold declarations, once interrupted dinner and said, "Mummy, when I grow up, I want to be the kind of woman who makes everywhere feel warm, like you." These were not coincidences. These were echoes. Maria began to understand that motherhood wasn't only about nurturing, it was about imprinting. Every hug, every story told at bedtime, every moment she chose not to shout, every time she knelt beside a crying child instead of walking away, had become a thread in the fabric of their becoming. And as she watched them grow, different in temperament, yet bound by invisible strings of shared love, she realized she had done more than escape loneliness. She had defeated it. Not by shouting at it, not by running from it, but by replacing it. The house that once began as a dream now lived as a truth. Maria, once the girl rearranging dolls for pretend birthdays, now found herself hiding tears during real birthday songs as her children blew candles and called out, "Come, Mummy, sit with us." And she did. Every time. Fully present. Fully seen. On a quiet Sunday morning, long after breakfast had been eaten and the children had scattered into their corners of the compound, Maria stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom. She looked at her reflection, not the tired eyes or the soft lines forming along her cheeks, but the light behind them. She wore a simple dress, her hair braided down into neat cornrows, and on her lips was a smile so tender it felt unfamiliar at first. She had made it. Through the doubts, the judgments, the long nights, the tears spilled in silence, she had arrived at a place where her past no longer held her by the throat. Joshua walked in and caught her staring. "You okay?" he asked. Maria turned to him and nodded. I am, she replied. I'm more than okay. He reached out and pulled her close. We did well, he whispered. We're still doing well, she replied, resting her head against his chest. Outside, the children were laughing, one of those wild, unfiltered giggles that bubbles from the belly and fills the sky. That sound, that sweet, unruly music, was the life she had always craved. Not quiet, not empty, not borrowed. Hers, made with love, with ache, with history. And as the breeze drifted through the window, fluttering the curtain like a page waiting to be turned, Maria exhaled with a kind of peace that didn't demand applause. She had finally become the woman the little girl in her had always needed. And for the first time in a long, long while, the silence, when it came, was full of rest, not regret. Loneliness doesn't always wear tattered clothes or cry loudly in public. Sometimes it sits quietly behind a smiling face, growing roots in silence. Maria's story reminds us that not every choice people make is about speed or carelessness. Sometimes it's about healing. Behind every decision is a story most people never ask to hear. Be kind before you assume. Listen before you label. Love before you lecture. Some people aren't rushing, they're recovering. You may not have grown up in a loud or loving home, but you can build one. And if you're already building it, don't let the world's noise drown out your purpose. The noise of criticism fades, the joy of legacy lasts. It's okay to live differently. It's okay to want more than survival. And it's okay to start over, even if you're doing it with kids tugging at your wrapper. So whether you're single, married, or somewhere in between, remember this: your story is valid. Your journey is yours. Heal at your pace. Build with love. And never feel guilty for turning your pain into purpose. Dear God, thank you for the gift of life, the healing that hides in laughter, and the strength you give us to rewrite stories we never chose. Thank you for mothers who give from empty wells and still find a way to overflow. Thank you for the women carrying silent wounds and turning them into gardens for their children to bloom. Lord, we ask for peace, not just in our homes, but in our hearts. Teach us how to build with wisdom. Help us to raise children not from fear, but from love. Replace every childhood ache with generational joy. Heal the girls inside us who cried alone, and strengthen the women we are becoming. Give us grace to rest, courage to be seen, and boldness to speak our truth without shame. For every listener who has felt invisible, Lord, remind them they matter. For every parent carrying unspoken burdens, send comfort. For every soul seeking wholeness, be the gentle answer that restores. May we never forget that healing is holy work, and that even when we feel unheard, you are always listening. And when the world does not understand our choices, let our peace speak louder than our defense. Let love be our loudest reply. In Jesus' name, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.